May 24, 1945. Moscow, Soviet Union. The war in Europe ended 16 days ago. The German military instrument destroyed, and its leadership in Allied captivity, and the Soviet Union is already engaged in the specific and contested work of deciding what the victory means and how it will be remembered. And Stalin has just issued an order that will shape the Soviet Union's understanding of how it was won for the next 46 years. The order is not published. It does not appear in the Soviet military journals or in the official communiques that the Soviet Information Bureau has been issuing throughout the war. It does not carry a stamp that says, Lend-Lease is henceforth forbidden as a subject of public discussion. It doesn't need to. The Soviet institutional system has been managing the relationship between official narrative and inconvenient truth for 25 years by the time the war ends, and the men who run its various components, the military journals, the publishing houses, the Historical Institute, the editorial boards, the political commissar network, do not need explicit instructions to understand what the changed political environment requires of them. The general direction is sufficient. The specific editorial decision about whether this specific article's acknowledgment of Lend-Lease truck deliveries is too prominent or sufficiently subordinated to the primary narrative of Soviet socialist achievement is a decision that each editor in each institution makes with the accumulated professional sensitivity of men who have been making these decisions under political supervision for their entire careers and who have learned, in the specific and unforgiving school of the Soviet institutional environment, that error in the direction of too much honesty is more dangerous than error in the direction of too little. The order arrives through the channels that Stalin's directives use when the directive is intended for institutional compliance rather than public information. Through the political commissar system, through the directives to the editorial boards of the military journals, through the guidance given to the historians who have already begun the work of assembling the official history of the Great Patriotic War that the Soviet Union will produce in the years following the victory. The directive's substance is specific and consistent across all the channels through which it flows, and its specific and consistent character reflects the institutional experience of a political system that has been managing inconvenient truth for 25 years, and that has developed, in that experience, a refined and effective methodology for doing so. The discussion of American and British Lend-Lease material assistance to the Soviet war effort, the trucks, the food, the aluminum, the telephone wire, the aircraft, the explosives, the steel, the boots and the wool, and the medical supplies, and the railroad equipment, whose combined presence in the Soviet military and industrial supply chain has been one of the most significant single factors in the Soviet war effort's logistical capacity, is to be minimized in public communication, placed in contexts that make clear its supplementary rather than decisive character, attributed where possible to the Soviet-American alliance's mutual interest rather than to the Soviet Union's specific material dependence on American output, and under no circumstances presented in terms that suggest the Soviet Union's victory was dependent on or significantly enabled by capitalist material assistance from its wartime allies. The political logic of the directive is the political logic of the entire Soviet ideological project. A communist state cannot acknowledge that the capitalist system, whose inferiority to socialism is the foundational proposition of the communist political program, has been the material enabler of the communist state's greatest military achievement, without undermining the foundational proposition at precisely the moment when its vindication by military victory is the most political significant event in the party's history. The directive is the product of the specific and well-understood logic of the Soviet political system. The Communist Party's narrative of the Great Patriotic War must be a narrative of Soviet socialist achievement, of the Soviet people's own resources and the Soviet military's own capability, whose outcome demonstrates the superiority of the socialist system rather than its dependence on the industrial output of the capitalist power across the Atlantic. What the Soviet generals who have been fighting the war for 4 years actually know about Lend-Lease, what they have seen in their motor pools, what they have eaten in their mess halls, what they have used to communicate with their artillery observers, what they have driven across the steppes in the advances that have taken them from Stalingrad to Berlin, is, after May 1945, a private matter. The generals know. They know because they were there. They know because the supply officer who briefed them on the available vehicle strength before every major offensive operation was reading from vehicle inventory records that showed Studebakers alongside the ZS-5s and the GAZ trucks, and that the operational planning had incorporated as a baseline of available transport capacity rather than as a bonus. They know with the specific and operational intimacy of men who have had to fight with what they had and who know precisely what the difference between what they had and what they would have had without Lend-Lease actually represents in the specific language of military logistics and military capability, in the language of truck days and ton miles and ammunition rounds per gun per day, which is the language that operational planning uses, and that does not accommodate the political narrative's requirement that the contribution be describable as supplementary when the planning calculations show it to be structural. But the generals are Soviet military officers, and Soviet military officers in 1945 do not publicly contradict directives that come from the level from which this directive has come. What they say in private, in the conversations with writers and historians and fellow officers that the Soviet security system cannot entirely monitor and suppress, in the letters that circulate in the specific and partially protected space of personal correspondence, in the memoirs that some of them begin writing with the understanding that the finished product will not be publishable until the political environment that has made them unreadable has changed, is a different account of the war's material realities than the one the official history is in the process of constructing. The official history that Stalin's directive is shaping is not entirely false, and the men who are being directed to shape it are not being asked to construct a pure fiction. The Great Patriotic War was the greatest military achievement in the history of the Soviet state, and the achievement was genuinely Soviet in its essential character. The soldiers who fought it were Soviet. The commanders who led it were Soviet. The industrial conversion that moved Soviet factories east of the Urals and rebuilt Soviet military production on the far side of the mountains was a Soviet achievement whose scale and speed has no precedent in industrial history, and that no amount of American Lend-Lease material can fully explain or fully credit. Because the Lend-Lease material arrives at plants and depots and distribution points that the Soviet industrial system has built and is staffed by workers, the Soviet industrial system has trained and is organized by managers, the Soviet economic system has developed. The achievements being described in the official history are real, the political function being served by describing them in the specific way that Stalin's directive requires is the function of a narrative that is simultaneously a historical account and a political instrument, and the political instrument's requirement that the narrative be a particular kind of historical account produces the specific selections and omissions that make it less than fully honest. The Soviet people's sacrifice, 27 million dead, the specific and incomprehensible number that the official Soviet figures will eventually acknowledge and that the scale of the fighting requires, is the central fact of the war's Eastern theater, and the official narrative is honest about the sacrifice, even when it is dishonest about the material context in which the sacrifice occurred. The dishonesty is specific and documentable. It omits from the narrative of the war's material realities the specific contribution of approximately 17.5 million tons of Lend-Lease material that the United States and Great Britain delivered to the Soviet Union across the war's 4 years. 14,795 aircraft, 7,056 tanks, 51,503 jeeps, 370 motorcycles, 8,701 tractors, 12,161 armored vehicles, 2.1 million tons of food, and the specific industrial equipment, railway rolling stock, communications equipment, and raw materials, whose comprehensive list the official Soviet histories of the war period do not provide, and whose absence from the official record is itself a form of historical falsification. The omission is not simply a matter of proportion, of claiming the contribution is smaller than it actually is, which the official Soviet histories also do when they are forced to acknowledge the contribution at all. consistently presenting Lend-Lease as representing approximately 4% of Soviet war production, when the specific calculation method being used to arrive at that figure excludes the categories of contribution, transportation, food, communications, where the Lend-Lease share is largest and most operationally significant. It is a matter of kind, of presenting the Soviet war effort as fundamentally self-sufficient in the material dimension, when the specific and documented evidence says otherwise. The omission is not simply a matter of proportion, of claiming the contribution is smaller than it actually is. It is a matter of kind, of presenting the Soviet war effort as fundamentally self-sufficient in the material dimension, when the specific and documented evidence of the supply records and the operational orders and the field commander's reports says that the self-sufficiency is partial, and that the parts that are not self-sufficient are the parts that matter most for the operational pace the campaigns require. The generals who know this best are the generals who have planned and commanded the great Soviet offensive operations of 1943 and 1944. The operations whose scale and tempo have required from the Soviet supply system a logistical performance, whose dependence on Lend-Lease, the planning documents, and the operational orders make unmistakable to anyone who reads them carefully, and whose specific knowledge is therefore the knowledge of men who have had to do the arithmetic that the planning requires. Operational planning at the army and front level is not an abstract exercise, and it is not a narrative exercise. It is a specific and quantitative process whose product is numbers, and the numbers are derived from the specific and actual resources available rather than from the resources that the political narrative requires to be available. The planning question is not, can we project a picture of Soviet self-sufficiency that the historical record supports? The planning question is, how many trucks are available? How much fuel per truck per day? What is the maximum daily advance rate that the available truck fleet can sustain, given the fuel consumption of the formation being sustained, and the distance from the supply base? What is the daily food requirement for the formation's manpower, and how many days' supply can be carried forward before the supply base must advance? What is the artillery ammunition consumption rate for the operational fire plan, and how many truck days are required to deliver the required ammunition to the gun positions? The planning question, in other words, is a question about what actually exists, because the answer to the planning question is going to be tested against reality on the day the operation executes, and reality does not accept political narratives as substitutes for actual trucks. Every answer to every question in this planning process is a number. The numbers come from supply records. The supply records are honest, in the specific way that supply records must be honest if the operations they support are to work. They record what is available, not what the political narrative requires to be available, because the artillery does not fire on what the political narrative says is in the ammunition dump, but on what the ammunition dump actually contains. The generals doing the operational planning have been reading the supply records. They know what the numbers are. Marshal Georgy Zhukov is the most important of these generals, and the one whose private admission has done the most to establish the documented historical record of what Soviet commanders actually knew about Lend-Lease. His conversation with the writer Konstantin Simonov, held in the years following the war, in the specific and partially protected space of a private conversation between a senior military figure and a writer whose public work has been dedicated to honest documentation of the war experience, and whose private notebooks are therefore the repository of the things that the honest documentation cannot yet publicly contain, a space whose protection depends on the assumption that the conversation will not be recorded in forms that the security system can intercept, or that the political authorities will ever see, is preserved in Simonov's notebooks, which Simonov maintains through his life with the specific and professional care of a writer who understands that what he is recording is more historically significant than what he is publishing, and which are eventually made available to historians in the post-Soviet period, when the distinction between what can be published and what must be preserved privately has been substantially dissolved by the changed political environment. What Zhukov tells Simonov is not a diplomatic acknowledgment of Allied assistance of the kind that wartime ceremony required Soviet generals to perform at Allied conferences and Allied meetings, where the political courtesy of acknowledging the contribution of one's allies was the price of continued cooperation. It is a specific and categorical statement about the war's material realities, offered in the private format of a conversation between a military man and a writer who has asked him directly and who has received in response the directness that the format and the relationship permit. Without the American aluminum, the specific and documented Lend-Lease aluminum deliveries whose incorporation into Soviet aircraft production has enabled the aircraft manufacturing rates that the Soviet air forces require, the Soviet Union could not have produced the aircraft that the air superiority operations of 1943 and 1944 require. Without the American steel, the deliveries of rolled steel and steel alloys whose specific metallurgical grades Soviet domestic production cannot produce in the quantities required, the tank and artillery production whose rates have been sustaining the offensive campaigns cannot be maintained. Without the American trucks, the logistics cannot function at the pace the campaigns require. This is not a statement about a supplement. This is a statement about a structural dependence. And Zhukov, the man who more than any other individual is responsible for the military outcomes that the structural dependence has helped to enable, says it as clearly as he knows how to say it, to a man who he trusts to record it honestly. This is not a footnote to the Soviet achievement. It is, in Zhukov's private assessment, a structural component of it. November 19, 1942. The Volga Steppe. Operation Uranus begins before dawn, with the sound of 3,500 Soviet guns opening simultaneously against the Romanian armies on the flanks of the German 6th Army encircling Stalingrad. The men of the 5th Tank Army and the 21st Army move forward through the Soviet autumn's specific mud and cold, across terrain whose flatness makes every vehicle visible from the air, and makes every advance a test of whether the supply chain behind the advance can keep pace with it. The trucks that carry the ammunition for those 3,500 guns, that move the fuel for the T-34s, and the cavalry horses, and the infantry's motorized support, that sustain in the field the 1 million men that Operation Uranus requires. These trucks are, in the documented proportion that Soviet vehicle inventory records preserve, Studebakers, American trucks. The Studebaker US-6 that American factories have been producing for the Lend-Lease program and that Soviet drivers have been learning to maintain, to repair, to drive across Russian terrain in conditions that the vehicle's American designers did not specifically anticipate, but that the vehicle's robust construction has proven capable of sustaining. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, who plans Operation Uranus alongside Zhukov, and who is in the specific position of the man who has had to account for the logistical resources available to the operation when he designs it, knows this. He knows the truck numbers. He knows that without the Studebakers, the Uranus timetable, the compressed schedule of force assembly that secrecy requires, and that Soviet horse-drawn transport at the scale available could not maintain, is not achievable in the form that the encirclement requires for its success. The encirclement succeeds. The pincers close at Kalach on November 23, after 4 days of the fastest and most decisive armored advance that the Soviet military has yet executed, surrounding approximately 300,000 German soldiers of the 6th Army in a pocket from which no breakout and no relief effort will ultimately save them. The vehicles that have moved the 5th Tank Army and the 21st Army from their assembly areas to their objectives, and that are now sustaining the inner and outer rings of the encirclement, the trucks that carry the ammunition for the guns and the fuel for the tanks, and the rations for the soldiers manning the encirclement perimeter, are still running. The Studebakers are still running. They are still running because the Studebaker US-6's mechanical reliability, in the specific and harsh conditions of the Volga Steppe in November 1942, exceeds the mechanical reliability of the domestic Soviet trucks that they are supplementing, and in many cases replacing, in the logistical order of battle that the Uranus planning has assembled. The truck records are classified. The planning documents that show the vehicle allocation are classified. The supply records that show what is arriving from Lend-Lease deliveries and what is being drawn from Soviet domestic production are classified at a level that prevents the journalists and the historians who are writing about Stalingrad from accessing them. Vasilevsky's private knowledge is filed away in the specific and well-organized cabinet of things that Soviet generals of his generation know and do not say in the forms that publication requires. The near failure in the Soviet general's private relationship with Lend-Lease truth, the moment when the specific and institutional pressure to suppress what they know about American material assistance comes closest to producing in individual commanders the kind of public acknowledgment that the directive has forbidden, and when the documentary record that the private military knowledge has been accumulating in the specific and semi-protected spaces of personal correspondence and private conversation and unpublished memoir drafts comes closest to breaking through the official narrative in a form that the censorship system cannot contain, arrives not in the immediate post-war period, when Stalin's authority and Stalin's security services are at their post-war peak, and when the specific and recent memory of what happens to people who contradict the official line is fresh enough to produce near-universal compliance. But in the years of Khrushchev's rule following Stalin's death in 1953, the de-Stalinization that Khrushchev initiates with the secret speech of February 1956 produces a specific and partial relaxation in the institutional climate that the Soviet system has maintained around the subjects that Stalin's authority has defined as politically dangerous, and the Lend-Lease question, while never explicitly rehabilitated, never made the subject of the kind of official reconsideration that Khrushchev applies to some of Stalin's most egregious distortions, benefits from this partial relaxation in the specific form of a somewhat less rigorous editorial management of the military journals and the military memoir publication process, in which the historians and editors who manage the process begin accepting formulations that acknowledge the Lend-Lease contribution in somewhat more precise terms than the immediate post-war period has permitted. Khrushchev's political project includes a partial rehabilitation of the wartime record that Stalin's most egregious distortions have produced, and within this project there is a specific and contested space for the question of Lend-Lease, a question that several Soviet military historians are attempting to address more honestly in the journals and monographs of the late 1950s and early 1960s, and that the political authorities are managing with the specific and inconsistent attention of a system that has relaxed some constraints without having decided exactly which constraints to relax and which to maintain. It is in this period that Khrushchev himself makes, in his memoirs, dictated on tape and smuggled to the West where they are published in 1970, as Khrushchev remembers, the most direct public statement about Lend-Lease that any senior Soviet official has yet committed to any record intended for public consumption. The statement is direct and unqualified, that without the food the Americans supplied, the Soviet army would have starved, that without the metal and the machinery, Soviet industry could not have produced the weapons the war required, that the official Soviet position minimizing Lend-Lease is, in Khrushchev's private judgment, dishonest. The statement appears in a memoir published in the West, and therefore deniable in the Soviet Union, where the KGB's response to Khrushchev remembers is to characterize it as a Western forgery whose attribution to Khrushchev is the invention of American intelligence operatives pursuing the Cold War's specific and cynical information operations. The characterization is untrue. The tapes from which the memoir is transcribed are authentic, recorded by Khrushchev on a device that he had been given as a gift and that he had used throughout the late 1960s to dictate the recollections that he understood would not be publishable in the Soviet Union in his lifetime. The specific language of the Lend-Lease admission is not the language of a man who is speaking for effect or who is making a political argument. It is the language of a man who is remembering something he experienced and who is describing what he experienced with the directness that memory of significant things tends to produce, that without the food, the soldiers would have starved, that without the metal, the factories could not have built what the war required, that the official position on Lend-Lease is wrong, and that Khrushchev knows it is wrong because he was a political officer on the fronts where the American material was being consumed, and he saw what it was, and he saw what happened when it was not available. The statement stands as the most consequential public acknowledgment by any senior Soviet figure of what the private military record has been documenting for 25 years. Marshal Ivan Konev, whose first Ukrainian front executes the Vistula-Oder offensive of January 1945, the fastest and deepest operational advance in the history of armored warfare, covering approximately 300 miles in 23 days against German resistance that includes not merely retreating formations, but organized defensive efforts from the Wehrmacht's remaining operational capability. Efforts that the offensive's pace renders insufficient to stop, but that are genuine rather than nominal, produced by a German military that has not yet accepted the war's conclusion, regardless of what the strategic situation says. Commands an army at the apex of Soviet operational excellence, whose motorized logistics are so dependent on American trucks that the operational planning for the Vistula-Oder offensive has to account for the Studebaker's specific fuel consumption and load capacity and road performance characteristics as primary variables in the logistics calculations that determine how fast the advance can go and how far the supply chain can sustain it before the forward supply dump must be moved forward and the truck turnaround time requires the rear area to advance. This is not a peripheral logistics detail. This is the fundamental operational constraint that determines whether the 300 miles in 23 days is achievable, and the logistics planners who determine that it is achievable are doing so on the basis of a truck fleet whose American component they have incorporated into the calculation as a known quantity with known performance characteristics. The offensive is achievable at 300 miles in 23 days, with the truck fleet that Lend-Lease has made available. Whether it is achievable at the same pace with a Soviet-only truck fleet is a calculation that the planning documents do not require to be performed, but whose answer the supply records make it possible to estimate. Konev's memoirs, published in the Soviet Union in 1966, do not say this. They describe the Vistula-Oder offensive in terms that the Soviet official history has established as appropriate. The organizational brilliance of Soviet operational planning, the courage of Soviet soldiers, the industrial achievement of Soviet war production. The trucks that sustain the advance are present in the memoirs in the way that trucks are present in all Soviet military memoirs of the period, as the background of the operational achievement, rather than as a structural component of it. What Konev says in private conversation, what the Soviet military historians who interview him in the course of research projects whose published outputs will be managed by the editorial system find when they press him on the material questions that the operational record raises, is closer to what Zhukov has told Simonov than to what the published memoir contains. The trucks were American, in the proportion that the vehicle inventory records document. Approximately 50 to 60% of the Soviet truck fleet in 1944 and 1945 consists of American Lend-Lease vehicles, whose contribution to Soviet motorized logistics, the operational planning, has incorporated as a baseline rather than as a supplement, because the Soviet domestic truck production whose replacement of the Lend-Lease contribution would be required to justify the claim of Soviet logistical self-sufficiency has not been producing at the rate that would make the replacement possible in the operational timeline the campaigns require. The food was American, in the specific quantities that the Lend-Lease food delivery records document, and that Anastas Mikoyan's papers, as administrator of the Soviet side of the Lend-Lease program, preserve approximately 4.5 million tons of American food delivered across the war's duration, including the canned meat that Soviet soldiers call tushonka, with an affection that reflects the specific intimacy of a food that has been sustaining them through the war's hardest years. The explosives, the TNT and the nitroglycerine, and the other energetic materials that Soviet munitions production has not been able to produce in the quantities that the artillery ammunition of the Great Offensives requires, were American, arriving through the Persian Corridor and the Arctic convoys in the specific quantities that the ammunition production records show being incorporated into Soviet artillery rounds and Soviet tank ammunition and the Soviet mines and demolition charges whose consumption across 4 years of the most intensive warfare in history produces material requirements that no domestic production system operating under wartime constraints can meet without external supplement. Without these inputs, the offensive could not have proceeded at the pace it proceeded at, and a slower pace means a different war. The legacy of what Soviet generals privately admitted about Lend-Lease, after Stalin forbade the discussion, after the Cold War's political logic reinforced the prohibition, after the official histories had been written in forms that the private military record contradicts on specific and documentable points, is a legacy that the post-Soviet archival opening has been assembling for 30 years, and that continues to be assembled as the Russian military archives release material that the Soviet classification system preserved and that the post-Soviet institutions have been making gradually available to researchers with the specific inconsistency of a process that reflects the continuing political sensitivity of the subject, rather than a systematic commitment to historical completeness. What the assembled record shows, the Zhukov-Simonov conversation, the Khrushchev memoirs, the operational planning documents that preserve the truck counts and the food requisitions and the aluminum allocations, the private correspondence of officers that Soviet literary archives have preserved in collections that outlasted the political environment that made them unpublishable, is that the private military knowledge of Lend-Lease's importance was widespread, consistent, and specific. The generals who fought the war knew what they fought it with. They knew what came from Soviet factories and what came from American ones. They knew what the ratio was. They knew because they had been doing the arithmetic that operational planning requires, and the arithmetic is not the arithmetic of a war fought with Soviet resources alone. The public narrative that Stalin's directive mandated, the narrative that the Soviet military's achievements were the product of Soviet socialist self-sufficiency, was a narrative that the private military record contradicts at every level at which the record is honest. The private military record is honest in the specific format of private military records, in the documents that operational necessity produces, in the conversations that political monitoring cannot entirely prevent, in the memoirs that the individual conscience and the professional honesty of men who have fought a great war and who know the truth about how it was fought, eventually produces when the political environment has changed enough to permit it. The war was won by Soviet courage, Soviet sacrifice, Soviet military genius, and American material. Every Soviet general who fought in it knew this, in the specific and operational sense, that men who have had to do the logistics arithmetic know a material fact, not as a political judgment, not as an ideological concession, but as the thing the numbers produce when you add them up honestly. The numbers are in the supply records. The supply records are in the archives. The archives have been opening, unevenly and incompletely, since the Soviet Union ceased to exist in 1991. And the picture that researchers have been assembling from what the archives have released is the picture that the private military knowledge of the Soviet generals has always been consistent with, and that the official Soviet history has always been inconsistent with. Stalin forbade the saying of it. Stalin's successors maintained the prohibition through the Cold War's entire duration, with the specific justification that the prohibition's political function had not diminished simply because Stalin himself had been posthumously criticized. The knowing could not be forbidden. The knowing exists in the supply records, and in the operational orders, and in the planning documents, and in the private correspondence, and in the Simonov notebooks, and in the Khrushchev tapes, and in the memoirs that were written in drawers and published after the political environment that had made them unpublishable had changed. It exists because it is true, and truth of the kind that Zhukov told Simonov, the truth that is carved into the specific and quantitative record of what was where and how it got there, is the kind that survives the systems designed to suppress it, and eventually finds its way to the record that history requires, and that the men who made the history had always, in the private and protected spaces that suppression can never entirely close, been telling each other.